The talk is divided into three different sections. The first one focuses on the border between Mexico and the United States, and the second one focuses on the border between Guatemala and Mexico, and the third one focuses on the effects of narco traffic on the topic of extinction in relation to border demarcations. And so the first section is titled A Digital Jaguar. In recent years, the damage to the environment produced by the structures placed upon the Mexico-United States border areas has garnered intensified interest from a manifold of both long-standing and not so common perspectives. And so here we have the tunnel of some articles showcasing the opposition of the tunnel of damnation against the wall, and then some images that depict art installations, film, and some videos. Art installations, media coverage, and film have addressed the ecological degradation produced by surveillance technologies, patrolling practices, and the border wall. Because of the magnitude, visibility, and clarity with which part of the damage created by the latter can be identified, it has been, by far, the major focus of attention in ecological-driven discourses framed by border contexts. The hyper-visible nature of the wall facilitates the exposure of much of the damage it creates. For instance, through a digital projection in 2017, Chicana photographer Ginny Sanchez and ecological artist Lauren Strohacker showcased the art installation on Fragmenting Desfragmentando, which sought to bring awareness regarding how the metallic structure interrupts non-human migratory corridors that are necessary to the survival of certain species. The following year, Mexican photographer Alejandro Prieto unveiled the Border Wall Project, which shows a handful of the 800 species of wildlife that are adversely affected by the wall. In light of the endangerment of the animals they portray, in both projects, the digital images can be seen as dynamic shadows, echoes, or ghosts that seem to plead for their survival. In The Mushroom at the End of the World, anthropologist Anna Singh states that ghostly presences remind us that we live in an impossible present, a time of rupture, a world haunted by the threat of extinction. End of quote. Thus, the conjured yet lively apparition of the animals offers a path to visualize an alternative reality in which all that is left of the showcased species is their non-material manifestation. Although both artistic endeavors aim to denounce the critical role played by the wall in the endangerment of species that are already vulnerable to the consequences of climate change and habitat loss, they also create other multi-layer effects. For instance, while the wall is the element that has the power to produce the destabilization of the modes of survival of jaguars and other animals, these projects modify that role. Through digital manipulation, the non-human animal becomes an inhabitant of the wall. The colorful dynamism of the spectral figure contrasts with the lifeless appearance of the rusted iron. Thus, the wall becomes the inert background upon which multiple images of a vibrant jaguar are portrayed. For a moment, the metal structure is the element that seems to be overpowered by the digital presence of the animal. In this way, as Latin American scholar Gabriel Giorgi argues, non-human animals can operate not just as symbols, but also as political emblems. Using the images of vulnerable flagship species, the Border Wall Project and On Fragmenting Desfragmentando feature the severe effects that result from the conflictive coexistence between human-made border structures and non-human entities. Putting together the images of spectral visions and ruined landscapes, these artistic endeavors synthesize two temporalities: a present in which a border wall is designed to discourage human migration through cruelty is also an ecological disaster, and a future in which the Sonoran Desert is filled with multiple absences and only populated by ghostly apparitions. Whereas, as this project illustrates, the magnitude of the wall makes some of the environmental-related challenges of the US-Mexico border region hyper-visible, the same cannot be said of other border regions. This is what happens in the Mexico-Guatemala-Belize borderlands, which are situated in the Selva Maya. the second largest tropical rainforest in the Americas. In this area, and particularly in the El Petén rainforest, the damage created by the combination of border demarcations and multiple ecosystems is non-visible or not immediately identifiable. And so with this, I'm going to go to the second section. El Petén is in the northernmost region of Guatemala and accounts for a third of the entire country, sharing large border sections with Mexico and Belize. And with only 8% of the original forest left, this region has been classified as critically endangered, and many of its non-human inhabitants are on the verge of extinction. This is a result of habitat loss, deforestation, the expansion of the agricultural frontier, hunting, and wildlife trafficking. The latter are activities that are often facilitated by the porous presence of a border demarcation. In what follows, I put into dialogue a Guatemalan short story with questions related to wildlife trafficking and poaching in the context of these tropical rainforests, as well as some of its direct and indirect relationships with border demarcations. To this end, I focus on the figure of the scarlet macaw. Even though scarlet macaws used to populate almost every rainforest in Central America, nowadays these forests are home to less than 1,000 of these animals. In the Guatemalan region, there are only around 300 left in the wild. Because of this, in 2019, the Central American scarlet macaw was classified as an endangered species. Written more than 30 years ago, Historia del Guacamayo, que se perdió en la materia, which is the title of the short story that I'm going to study, written by Guatemalan author Mario Palleras, frames this contemporary reality and offers a species-transcending approach to address the challenges faced by these birds. The story narrates the journey of a scarlet macaw from the Guatemalan rainforest to a zoo in Belgium. At the beginning of the narration, the author quickly introduces the main character. Quote, "At 32 years of age, the macaw began his happy trajectory through matter." End of quote. The peaceful image of a bird who is flying is abruptly interrupted by the menacing presence of humans. Quote, "That year, poachers were annihilating the colorful species of the forest." After this sequence, Palleras describes how, to trap the bird, the poachers left an orange at the end of a cage. Because macaws cannot resist the smell of oranges, they always enter the cage, and once inside, they cannot find their way out. This multi-species interaction resonates with anthropologist Emily Wanderer's notion of biologies of betrayal, which she describes as the process by which humans take care of certain species in order to gain knowledge of what they like and dislike. Once the habits and preferences of the animals are learned, they can be easily betrayed. The information they shared with the people who watched and cared for them is used to trap or exterminate them. In the short story, the macaw's love for oranges is weaponized against them. After this incident, the narrator focuses on describing the bird's complex reactions to an unwanted journey in a new mode of living. In drawing attention to the actions of the scarlet macaw, the author emphasizes the affective and human-like traits of this non-human character. By doing this, instead of challenging human exceptionalism, the author seems to embrace it. As Ursula K. Hayes notes, animal studies theorists have long argued that, quote, "the boundaries between humans and other species are not fixed in nature, but set up through cultural practices and therefore always retain a certain degree of arbitrariness." End of quote. Through the description of the bird's affective responses to his entrapment, Palleras' short story challenges the division between the category of the human and the non-human. Quote, "At noon, he realized that he had been forever banished from the sky." And then another quote from the story. "He frequently mistook the morning noise of cars with the sound of the river where he had spent his first youth." Although brief, the previous examples underscore the dispossession and nostalgia endured by the bird, a character that in the story constantly displays embodied emotions often thought of as essentially human. The main method through which the author manages to describe the macaw's reactions and thus the emotions this convey is by reading the language of the non-human body. The body operates as the main channel through which the bird communicates his sadness, desperation, and melancholy. Mario Palleras was born in Chimaltenango, Guatemala in 1940 and died in Mexico in 1995. In the context of the 36-year-long civil war in which more than 200 people were killed, most of whom were Mayan persecuted for their land, he was one of the commanders of the Ejército Guerrillero de los Pobres and organized the Organización del Pueblo en Armas. These guerrilla movements focused on attracting indigenous people to join their cause. In response to widespread human rights violations, only in the 80s, nearly 76,000 Guatemalans were exiled in Mexico. It was during his exile, which lasted 20 years, that Palleras wrote this short story, which narrates the experience of a bird forced to live away from home. Quote, "The roots of light and the life cycles of fruits were gradually erased from his memory. However, he was happy for another 32 years. When he grew old, his wisdom was reduced to the certainty that matter is full of birds and that these birds follow countless paths. That is the origin of the infinite possibilities of forgetting, or to forget. Whereas the narrator is the one articulating this understanding, he does so based on the measured attitude and day-to-day movements of a bird who once fought with all the strength of his body to break free. Because of the experience of the author with exile, it is possible to identify clear parallelisms between his background and the bird's new reality. Thus, because of a connection founded on the pain that comes from being forcibly away from home, the perspective conveyed by the narrative voice, along with the bird's actions, transmit a form of common wisdom that transcends the limits between species. This wisdom is communicated by the embodied resignation of the bird and by the linguistic articulation of the narrator. Both the narrator and the non-human protagonist transmit conjoined responses of self-awareness, nostalgia, pain, and wisdom, because these type of attitudes are part of the human exceptionalism framework. By appearing not only through the human narrator but also through the bird, the boundaries between them collapse. Furthermore, since the author emphasizes the affects, creativity, and knowledge of the bird, in human terms, he is not only blurring the limit between one and the other, but also portraying the bird through what Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro calls the inner human form of the animal. Given that as a species, humans tend to care less about what lies beyond the category of the human, the story suggests that to prevent extinction, it is necessary to fully embrace human exceptionalism, although, as it happens in the story, in a way in which the exception becomes a rule. It is important to note that the story does not engage with the social conflicts that in some instances give rise to wildlife trafficking. In Guatemala, nearly 60% of the population lives in economic precarity, with 40% of indigenous people enduring extreme poverty. Because of lack of opportunities and financial hardship, locals from rural communities have had to recur to practices such as agricultural burns and wildlife trafficking to survive. As the local journalist Rodrigo Soberanes puts it, quote, "In some cases, wildlife trafficking is one of the few ways to make a decent income." Because of this, anthropologist Michel Rader contends, conservationist groups sometimes place responsibility for ecological destruction on locals, ignoring both structural pressures and powerful wealthy actors. Whereas in the short story, Palleras does not acknowledge the social and economic inequalities that ignite the wildlife trafficking industry, and on the contrary, villainizes the poachers. In a different short story from the same collection, he mentions that in the Guatemalan rainforest exists, quote, "an ongoing war against birds waged by hunger." In addition, environmental-related concerns often result in the intensification of the presence of the army in protected areas. And this presence leaves indigenous people in a position of increased vulnerability. In this way, the story refers to how wildlife trafficking participates in broader issues related to environmental, social, and economic injustices. Although the threat faced by these birds affects the Central American rainforest in general, there are certain areas in which economic precarity becomes more dangerous, for instance, in the Guatemalan borders, and particularly in El Petén. For more than a century, Belize and Guatemala have been unable to resolve a territorial conflict that involves nearly 4,600 square miles, which is equivalent to almost half of Belize's entire territory. Because of this conflict, the Zona de Adyacencia was created, which demarcates an invisible, porous, and not fully delineated border. This border area, which is located at the center of the division between the two countries, is inhabited by nearly 5,000 people, all of whom live in conditions of extreme precariousness and many of which participate in wildlife trafficking. In addition, because this is a buffer zone, efforts to protect endangered species are often interrupted because organizations coming from one side or the other do not always know who has jurisdiction over the territory. Because of this, conservationists from the area have taken extreme measures, such as spending entire days and nights under trees to make sure that the birds and their nests are safe. At this point, it is also important to note that, as Rather states, many of the people working in conservation are also local residents. Although when Payeras wrote this short story, the scarlet macaw was not yet endangered. Through this species, the author was able to foresee what will become one of the most pressing issues in relation to the Guatemalan rainforest in particular and to the Selva Maya at large, species extinction. Even though this threat is pervasive in almost every rainforest, the social and economic conditions that affect border regions facilitate the success of some of the practices that can accelerate it. For instance, the conditions that sustain drug trafficking across borders are similar or equal to those that sustain the traffic of wildlife. In addition, territorial conflicts between two countries put a strain on conservation efforts. The social and economic disparities that many times affect border communities at higher rates also contribute to this industry. In this way, this short story presents a framework to think about the bounds across species in the context of the threat of extinction and geopolitical borders. And then I'm going to go to the third section, which addresses the role of narcotraffic. In 2009, a picture depicting a group of military men standing right next to the inert body of the hippopotamus they had just killed shook Colombia. It was soon revealed that the name of the animal was Pepe, a former exotic mascot of Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar. It is very well known that in the 80s, Escobar acquired 4 hippos as part of his desire to collect hundreds of species from across the world. His goal was to create the equivalent of a Noah's Ark in the streets of the Latin American country, and was able to get more than 1,500 exotic species. After the death of Escobar in 1993, many of these animals were left to fend for themselves in a strange land. Whereas some sources affirm that the hippos were obtained directly from their native Africa, others sustain that they were bought from a zoo in the United States. Regardless of the place from where they were procured, a few elements from this scenario are relevant to the general scope of this talk. First, Pepe's acquisition is framed within one of multiple non-human animal migration patterns. The displacement of this animal is directly related to legal and illegal global wildlife trade, an enterprise stimulated by a set of complex economic dynamics that human geographer Rosemary Claire Collard has described as capitalist interspecies relations, which form and are embodied by the exotic pet. In addition, Pepe's death illustrates the violent consequences produced by the vulnerability of the non-human that accompanies its newfound relationship with humans. Once free and independent, captive species become individuated and alienated, and the animal is placed in a state of forced dependency on humans, thus subjected to the whims, wishes, and perceptions of the people who surround them. Pepe's death drew national and international outcry. This can be attributed to various factors, such as the notoriety of his former owner, the likability of the also called river horse, and the spectacle of violence portrayed in the infamous picture. The aforementioned possibilities underscore some of the elements that determine the level of visibility that can receive any given vulnerable or endangered animal. Questions regarding the popularity and charm of the threatened species, as well as the possibility to make the urgency and extent of the threat visible, play a central role in measuring the type and scale of the attention that any given case will receive. Charming, visible, popular, and with a threat that turned into a spectacle, Pepe inspired local animal rights movements and, alongside the rest of Escobar hippos, became the drive behind various narrative elements of literary works, such as the narco novels, Fiesta en la Madriguera by Mexican author Juan Pablo Villalobos, and El ruido de las cosas al caer by Colombian writer Juan Gabriel Vázquez. In both novels, the narrative underscores the lavish lifestyle of the characters through the commodification of the animals, who are capital in the sense that they are stock of possessions generating value and that operate as evidence of power and status. Echoing not just Escobar's eccentric fixation on wildlife, but also that of Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and of at least 3 other Mexican drug kingpins who also had private zoos with dozens of exotic species. In the novel Trabajos del Reino, Mexican author Yuri Herrera portrays a spectacle of caged animals that surround the cartel's leader headquarters. In this instance, the main non-human figures that are portrayed are not hippos but exotic birds and large felines. Something similar happens in Fiesta en la Madriguera. We don't use our tigers for suicides or for murders. Misli and Chichilquali do the murders with orifices made from bullets. I don't know how we do the suicides, but we don't do them with tigers. We use the tigers for eating the corpses, and we use our lion for that too. But we mainly use them for looking at, because they're strong and really well-proportioned animals, and they're nice to look at. It must be because they're so well-fed. In addition to operating as symbols of economic power, the depiction of exotic animals in these 2 novels, particularly tigers and lions, can be seen as a medium to overemphasize the dominant characteristics of the portrayed narco leaders, who exert their control over powerful and territorial species, thus maximizing both their authority and the fear they want to instill into their enemies. The previous quote also underscores how, in the words of Collard, exotic animals, quote, are framed in relation to human usefulness and are part of forming animal fetishism or the designation of an animal as thing-like, the denial of its complex life history. Notwithstanding the multiple connections that can be made between drug lords and exotic animals, this relationship is not one of the main elements that might come to mind when thinking about the illegal drug trade. Among the most common elements that tend to be linked to this underworld industry are the different manifestations of ongoing violence in rural and urban spaces, as well as the cultivation, sale, and circulation of drugs. As it has been widely documented, the illicit distribution of drugs depends on the successful crossing of borders in an unauthorized manner. It is no coincidence that the men who have found or created effective and reliable methods and passageways to transport drugs across geopolitical demarcations have also been able to acquire dozens and in some cases hundreds of species from all over the world. As Collard states, drug trafficking and wildlife trafficking do sometimes go hand in hand. Drugs and animals are occasionally traded by the same individuals and networks. In addition, a recent report on transnational organized crime found that, quote, the illegal trafficking of species is the 3rd most lucrative criminal activity and represents one of the greatest dangers to biodiversity. Such criminal activity is often intrinsically related to drug and arms trafficking. However, it is important to note that wildlife trafficking is not a centralized industry. Furthermore, drug lords are far from being the only people with a taste for exotic pets. I end this talk with the image of a secret airstrip that was uncovered in 2017 in Guatemala's Laguna del Tigre National Park. This tarmac runway is closely linked to drug, human, and animal trafficking. Hidden in the adjacent forests, the clandestine airstrip is conveniently located in close proximity to the Mexican border, which is why it is easy to infer that such is the reason this was the space chosen as a landing and departure location. Furthermore, this is not the only illegal airstrip that has been found in this border area. According to local authorities, 80 secret landing strips have been built and destroyed since at least 2006. To build each one of them, it is necessary to clear and fragment large sections of the already endangered forest. And some sources say that at least 80 airstrips have been found. Some others put that number at 65, but there are a few that estimate that there's been more than 100 airstrips all over this national park. And so with that, I end this talk, and I thank you for being here, and I